In Pro Tools 9, you can use any core audio interface on the Mac or any ASIO interface under Windows. You must first tell Pro Tools that you're using a non-Avid Digitisign audio interface. And the way we do that is we choose Playback Engine under the Setup menu. Now at the very top of the screen, I choose the current engine. If I have an HD card in my computer, I will choose the very top option, which is HD TDM. I can now use the built-in inputs or outputs of my computer using Core Audio or ASIO under Windows, and I can see all of my Core Audio interfaces. I also have this Pro Tools Aggregate I/O. This is Mac only, and what it lets me do is use my Audio MIDI setup to create a virtual audio interface combining one or more of my existing audio interfaces. For example, in this setup, I've combined an 828 Mark III with an original 828, and I can now use that as a single virtual interface from Pro Tools. I just choose that Pro Tools Aggregate option. If I want to configure my Core Audio or ASIO interface, I can go under the Hardware option, and I have only one button to launch the Setup app for the specific audio interface. In my case, I'm launching the Mo2 audio setup. If you have HD equipment, there's more to set up, obviously, from this screen. Under the I/O settings option, I can map all of my inputs and outputs to the inputs and outputs on my audio interface. You can see here I have a surround setup. Notice, by the way, that there's no more new subpath option. This was how you used to be able to create subpaths or subcomponents of a surround setup, for example. And now you simply create the new path and you can have overlapping paths. So for example, if I want to add a center output, I just simply create one, assign it to output 3, which goes to my center speaker, and that's all there is to it. Let's create some rear outputs. I'll assign them to 5 and 6 and move them up. So we can now create overlapping paths both for inputs and outputs. Now buses work slightly differently. We no longer have all the numbered buses that we had in previous versions of Pro Tools. We just create a bus, and we can create up to 256 of them in the HD versions of the software, slightly less in other versions. And you give it a name and tell it what format it is, and that's all there is to it. There's another easier way to create buses, and I'll show you that in a moment. There's one other significant change to the I/O setup, and that's with import settings. We can export our I/O settings and import them into other sessions. You used to be able to import all of these settings in one fell swoop just by clicking Import Settings. Well, now Import Settings only imports the settings on a single tab. So if you're on the Bus tab, it will only import bus settings, or the Output tab, or the Input tab. That works great, but sometimes you still want to import all of your I/O settings. You can still do that, but you have to hold down the Option key when you do it. So if you hold down Option on the Mac or Alt on Windows and click Import Settings, it will import all of your I/O settings, input, outputs, and buses. Now you can see I have a bunch of tracks assigned to my front outputs, and I have some assigned to my surround outputs. Let's say I want to create a reverb that's specific for my bell instruments. Let's say my celeste and any other bells I have. Well, I can do that in a very easy way in Pro Tools 9. Before, I would have to create an aux track, create a new bus, and then create a send that went to that new bus. Now I can do that all together. From my send dropdown, I can now choose my outputs on my audio interface as well as my buses, just like before. But I can also send directly to another track if I have an aux track set up already, or create a new track, and that's what we'll do now. Now when I create a new track, I can tell Pro Tools the type of track, in this case a stereo aux input, and I can give it a name. We'll call this Celeste Reverb. And in one motion, Pro Tools creates a bus called Celeste Verb. It creates a new aux track called Celeste Verb, with the input as my new bus, and that's all there is to it. So in one motion, I create the bus, I create the aux track, and I do the correct mapping. Now if I look under my I/O setup, there is my new Celestvera bus. It's added for me. And that's all there is to it. So this new track option greatly facilitates the setup of sends and buses. It's a nice new feature available in all versions of Pro Tools 9.